stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the man from Leng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am continuing my reviews of the player cards in Carcosa. This time we are looking at the Survivor cards. There are 2 in this pack. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. The first Survivor card in this pack is an upgrade for Newspaper, an asset that was released way back in the Essex County Express. This version will cost you 2 experience points and 1 resource. It has 2 intellect skill icons, the item trait, and it will take up a hand slot. It has the game text, you get +2 intellect while investigating if you have no clues. It also has a response trigger. When you would discover 1 or more clues at your location, if you have no clues, discover an additional clue at your location. When I saw this card was coming out in Carcosa, I went back to listen to my original review of Newspaper from the Essex County Express. I think that review was probably only the second batch of reviews that I did for the game, so my delivery and the production values were still pretty rough back then. It wasn't quite as painful to listen to as I expected, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't wince a few times while I was listening to it. I wasn't very enthusiastic back then about the Level 0 Newspaper when it was released. If you're playing in solo, it's not the type of card that you can really rely on for all of your investigation needs, since it basically becomes a blank asset once you've got a single clue under your belt. And it doesn't really shine in multiplayer either, since there are just so many more clues on the board to gather. To the best of my knowledge, I've played Newspaper twice. That's in 2 different decks. Once was in a Lola Hayes deck, and the other was in an Ashcan Pete build that I took up against the Where Doom Awaits scenario. In that particular scenario, you cannot rely on Duke to pass investigation skill tests at the base of the hill or the ascending path. So having a card like Newspaper is just a fantastic way to provide a static boost to your intellect at those locations. It's not great once you've got a clue, but if you need to investigate those locations so you can get to the clues, Newspaper is one of the few ways that will help you with those locations. Now, Level 2 Newspaper costs the same as its Level 0 counterpart, and it gives you an additional intellect skill icon. It does provide the same static boost to your intellect, but now it lets you discover an additional clue at your location as long as you have no clues. Now, there are a couple of ways that survivors can discover clues besides taking investigate actions. If you've got the Level 2 Newspaper on the table when you play Look What I Found, for example, you'll gather 3 clues instead of 2. You'll also discover an extra clue if you discard your Gravedigger Shovel. Level 2 Newspaper will also snag you an extra clue if you're playing cards like Art Student, the Mystic Event Drawn to the Flame, the Guardian Event Evidence, Right of Seeking, or Working a Hunch. I quite like the small tempo boost that Level 2 Newspaper provides. If you're playing the card in solo, it will speed up how quickly you advance the Act deck, and as you know, the faster you advance the Act deck, the faster you'll clear the clues off your investigator so you can continue to benefit from Newspaper's bonuses. I could also see playing Level 2 Newspaper in a multiplayer deck in which gathering clues isn't the primary focus of that deck. Recently I've been playing in a multiplayer campaign with Mark, Min, Akachi, and William Yorick. And Yorick's primary role in that party is to deal with enemies, while Min, and to a lesser extent Akachi, are the ones who gather the clues. If there are no enemies on the table, then Yorick can pitch in with his Gravedigger Shovel and or take investigate actions to discover a clue or 2. I quite like the idea of playing a card like Level 2 Newspaper in that type of deck, because you're taking relatively few investigate actions during each act, and that's really all Newspaper is good for anyway. Newspaper can improve the odds that those rare investigate actions will be successful, and you'll discover an extra clue to boot, which improves your team's overall tempo a slight bit. Yorick has quite a bit of experience to spend heading into a Phantom of Truth, so I may just give Newspaper a try in that particular deck. I think it would work quite well. Newspaper is one of those cards that I really have a love-hate relationship with since it came out in the Essex County Express. I love that +2 intellect bonus, but just hate the fact that it's so fleeting. You know, one clue and it's blank. And as we all know, blank cards aren't really that great. You can't rely on Newspaper for all of your investigation needs, and its value can swing wildly from scenario to scenario, depending on the number of clues in play, the act deck, and how many clues it will take to advance, as well as the scenario mechanics. And by that I mean just how long you're going to be hanging on to your clues. If you're going to discover clues and they're going to be sitting on your investigator for a long time during the game, then a card like Newspaper is obviously not as powerful. So that type of inconsistency makes it really difficult to recommend playing Newspaper in a lot of different decks. Now, level 2 Newspaper suffers from some of the same problems, but it does improve your tempo, which I think is a big plus overall. I think Newspaper is really at its best in scenarios where you're able to advance the act deck quickly, and discovering that extra clue helps you make that a reality. Level 2 Newspaper could also be, I think it could be useful in solo or multiplayer, but I really think it's one of those cards that you really need to evaluate on a deck by deck or even a scenario by scenario basis. It's a little harder to do that if you're paying 2 experience points for a card, but if you've played through a campaign before and you sort of know what's coming up, that's probably the best way to judge whether upgrading to Newspaper is a good idea or whether those 2 experience points would be better spent elsewhere. The second Survivor card in the pack is Infighting. It's a 1-cost event that costs 3 experience points. It has 2 intellect and 2 agility skill icons and the trick trait. It has the game text Fast. Play after the enemy phase begins. Cancel all attacks made by non-elite enemies against you this phase. When I saw this card for the first time, it didn't ring true thematically for me. With a name like Infighting, I was expecting something along the lines of, enemies at the same location fight and damage and kill each other, rather than, simply enemies won't attack you. Or even something along the lines of the Lord of the Rings card of the same name that lets you move damage from one enemy to another. I'm not sure how useful that would be in the Arkham horror context, but it is a different effect. I guess the fact that the enemies are too busy bickering amongst themselves to bother finishing you off is how the card is supposed to operate. But personally, I kind of like the enemies attacking each other angle more. If you're looking for that type of effect, you'll have to play either version of Aquina, the Forgotten Daughter. Who knows, perhaps down the road we'll see an event that does something similar to what Aquina does. Thematic issues aside, I think canceling enemy attacks is still a relatively rare effect in the Arkham Horror LCG. Dodge, the Guardian event from the core set, is really still the gold standard against which all other cards are measured. For a single resource, you can cancel an attack against any investigator at any location at pretty much any point in the game. That makes the card incredibly versatile. The only problem with the card, of course, is that it's a one-shot event, so it's not going to help you all that much if you've got multiple enemies bearing down on you. But it doesn't matter, it's non-elite enemies, elite enemies. You can cancel an attack by any enemy at almost any time. Now, earlier in this cycle, Guardians received Heroic Rescue, which doesn't cancel an attack so much as just redirect it to another investigator who is better equipped to handle it. So it's not quite the same, but it will prevent an enemy from attacking another investigator. I've tested Heroic Rescue in a William York deck, but it hasn't worked out quite as well as I had hoped. So I think I'm kind of on the fence about that one. Mystics have, of course, they've got Hypnotic Gaze, which is a much more expensive dodge with a bonus tacked on. Rogues have Narrow Escape, which only cancels attacks of opportunity, and Suggestion, the asset from Black Star's Rise that will cancel an attack by a non-elite enemy for the cost of a charge. And I won't forget Skid's O'Toole signature event on the Lamb, even though it's probably one of the most forgettable signature cards in the game. Survivors have a couple of options at their disposal if they're attacked. Of course, there's the Aquina the Forgotten Daughter, who I mentioned earlier. She won't cancel the attack, but she will redirect the damage. Unfortunately, you will still take the horror, if any, so you've got to you've either got to put that horror on Aquina or take it yourself. The other option is to play Hiding Spot, which makes all enemies at a location aloof. There are pros and cons to this approach, however. On the one hand, an aloof enemy won't attack you during the investigation or enemy phases. On the other, Hiding Spot doesn't really help you if you're already engaged with an enemy, since it only makes them aloof. It won't. The card doesn't cause them to disengage. Hiding Spot isn't really ideal either if you were hoping to kill an enemy while avoiding its attacks, since enemies with the aloof keyword won't engage you automatically, and you can't damage them unless they're engaged with you. The other problem is that Hiding Spot doesn't turn off the Hunter keyword, so if you drop a Hiding Spot on a location full of enemies to safely move through it, any enemy with the Hunter keyword will give chase the following enemy phase, and it will likely attack you. So along comes Infighting, which provides Wendy, Ashcan, William, and Lola with a way to cancel an attack or attacks by enemies during the enemy phase. Infighting has a couple of things going for it. First off, it's got a pile of intellect and agility icons. Wow, it's 2 apiece. That's pretty great. Second, it's cheap at 1 resource, so you can play it in several different types of survivor decks. You can probably even wedge it into a Dark Horse build, owing to the fact that it only does cost 1 resource. Third, it will cancel all attacks made by non-elite enemies, and we've seen several cards this cycle that help investigators deal with a swarm of enemies, and I expect we'll see that swarm mechanic take center stage during a campaign at some point down the line. So it's good that that survivors will have some way to deal with swarms if and when they arrive. Infighting also has a couple of strikes against it, though. First, it only cancels attacks made by non-elite enemies, and those enemies need to attack you during the enemy phase. That doesn't make the card very versatile. It also costs 3 experience points, which is a lot for a survivor. That's really at the top end of the survivor scale. So I expect a card to do something pretty special for that, but Infighting is quite narrow. The biggest problem I have with Infighting is that most investigators in the survivor class have cheaper, more versatile options. For example, William Yorick can take dodge, which is better in almost every way, and so can Ashcan for that matter. The only problem with dodge, of course, is that you can't cancel attacks by multiple enemies. But in the games I've played, multiple enemies seems like it's quite rare right now. Like you might have 1 or 2, but I can't recall a game where I've been swarmed by 3 or 4 enemies that I would need a card like this. Now I guess you could play Yorick play Infighting in combination with a card like level 2 Taunt from the Dunwich Legacy to engage all the enemies and then cancel their attacks. I'm just not quite sure what you do for an encore once you've engaged all the enemies, considering Yorick does have access to the machete, which is a fantastic weapon, but it only works really if you're fighting enemies one-on-one. It doesn't work if you were swarmed by enemies, if you were playing this Taunt Infighting combo. So that's not going to work very well. By the same token, I've never really felt the need to buy the level 2 version of Taunt, much less Infighting, for any of my Yorick decks so far, and I don't see that being a need in the future, although you never know. If Wendy, Ashcan, William, and Lola are really worried about getting ganked by enemies during the enemy phase, you can also simply drop a Hiding Spot on that location during their turn. It'll basically do the same job against enemies with the Hunter keyword, and it doesn't cost 3 experience points. Hiding Spot is also a lot more versatile since it can cancel attacks during the investigation phase too, if you play your cards right. I recently tested Hiding Spot in a Calvin Wright deck while on holidays, and that card did some serious work. And I just don't see Infighting pulling that same kind of weight as Hiding Spot can. Hiding Spot is just that much more versatile. When I think about a card like Infighting, I keep coming back to one word, and that's versatility. You've heard me say it a few times already. Infighting offers a ton of skill icons, and it will cancel all attacks made by enemies against you, but it will protect you only during the enemy phase. That's a pretty narrow window compared to the other options such as dodge or hiding spot. Hell, even Aquina will basically cancel an attack made against you during any phase if necessary, and she'll damage the enemy to boot. Infighting's lack of versatility means I'm very unlikely to play this card anytime soon. However, that could change if swarms of enemies with the hunter keyword start to appear in scenarios. I guess we'll find out soon enough, because I see that the Forgotten Age is being released in less than 2 weeks. So if there's one place I expect to encounter swarms of enemies, it's a jungle setting, and from all indications we'll be heading into the jungle. So we'll have to see if we're beating off having to beat off hordes of snakes as they try to attack us and poison us. That's going to do it for my review of the Survivor cards in Dim Carcosa. Survivors received quite a few good cards this cycle, including Resourceful, A Test of Will, Waylay, and True Survivor. I'd put both of these cards towards the bottom of the pile. Newspaper's value really depends a lot on the scenario and how much you expect to be investigating. In a scenario like Echoes of the Past, I think it can be quite good, because your primary goal is to advance that act deck as quickly as possible. It's not nearly as helpful in a scenario such as a Phantom of Truth or Black Star's Rise, where your investigator tends to hang on to clues for a longer period of time. Certainly in a Phantom of Truth, if you need to spend those clues to automatically evade the Organist, they're going to be sitting on your investigator card for quite a while, and so Newspaper isn't going to help you grab more clues. I do have one deck, though, that I think Newspaper is going to work very well in, so I'm quite optimistic about its potential there. Unfortunately, I can't really say the same about Infighting. This card is going to struggle to find a home index because I think more versatile options exist, including dodge and hiding spot. I won't be including this card in my decks for now, but that could change in the not-so-distant future. We've seen a lot of cards this cycle that are paving the way for some sort of swarm mechanic, and I wouldn't be surprised if the jungles of the Forgotten Age are teeming with all types of enemies. That is going to do it for my look at the Survivor cards in Dim Carcosa. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.